Good morning. Good to be speaking to you this morning. I'm going to be continuing a series that we have been working through over the last few weeks. If you're new with us, we've been looking at John's Gospel and working through the different stories and different teaching that John brings through his Gospel under the banner Life in His Name. John writes his Gospel with the intention that through it we discover something about God that releases life into us. And that's no different in the passage that we're looking at this morning. My title today is The Provision. And we are going to be looking at the first part of John chapter 6. And I'm going to start straight away by reading the first 15 verses. Text will come up on the screen and you can follow it as I read. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely that this is the prophet who is come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. This incredible story of miraculous provision will be familiar to anyone who's read any of the Gospels. In fact, it's the only one of Jesus' miracles that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. And so you only need to start that journey of reading about the story of Jesus' life to come across this feeding of the 5,000. This incredible, vast crowd that have followed Jesus to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. They're drawn by his teaching, they're drawn by his miracles and healings. They're gathered in a remote mountainside area looking for more. And as the day goes on, inevitably, they all get hungry. And Jesus incredibly takes 5 small barley loaves, 2 small fish, all that a young boy had to offer. He gave thanks for what he had, and he distributes food so that everybody is satisfied and 12 baskets are left over. It's an absolutely incredible story of miraculous provision. I've, at times, touched something similar. And maybe some of you have as well. Nothing quite on the scale, but I do remember being responsible at one point for the organisation of a conference, and we had about 950,000 people gathered for this conference over 4 different days. And each day, caterers would come in with the lunch. And on one particular day, they were later than normal, which was the beginning of a little bit of concern. And eventually we got a phone call saying, "We're really sorry we're running late, we will be there." Sure enough, they arrived, and we had just about enough time before the scheduled lunch break to get all the food out of their vans and onto the tables. And what quickly became apparent, just by comparison with how much food had been served yesterday, was that what had been put out was never going to feed 950 people, possibly 600 or 700, but there were empty tables. You know, we had rows and rows and rows of tables that were supposed to be laid out with food, and a number of them were empty. And such was their delay that there was no time to get a message into the auditorium, no time to say, please would everybody be polite, you know, think of the people at the back and all of that kind of stuff. We just literally had 950 people walk into the auditorium for their lunch. After some mild panic, it occurs to us that really there's absolutely nothing that we can do other than stand back, watch, and pray. And so a number of us are just huddled, shaking a little bit in a corner, praying and watching as 950 people had their lunch. And no one passed comment about the quantity. No one thought, I'll take a bit less because there are some others at the back of the queue. Everyone was fed. And all of us went, well, this is our story of the feeding of the 5,000. I mean, the numbers don't quite work, but this is our story of the feeding of the 5,000. I was talking to Krista probably just about a year and a half ago about an evening at Open Well, the never-ending slow cooker. Similar scenario, you just keep ladling it out. God does some incredible miracle. He's still the God of multiplication, still the God of provision. And here we have this incredible story. And we're going to look at specifically John's retelling. We could look at it from all four Gospels, but I want us today to see, well, what is it that John wants us to see in the way that he's told this story? And we're going to do that by looking at the story from different angles. We're going to look at this story of provision from four different perspectives. From the perspective of Philip, from the perspective of Andrew, from the crowds, and then lastly, from John himself. And for each of these different perspectives, I've tried to sort of bring a characteristic to it to summarize perhaps what we can see. So first of all, let's look at Philip. Philip, I've characterized as the analyst. There he is, a little picture of Philip with his calculator. Don't know how much sums you can do on that, but it works for him. So Philip is one of Jesus' disciples. He is the local boy. He is from this area. He knows these hills. He knows this region well. And Jesus asks him, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, being local, his mind probably rushes to where the nearest Tesco's is. Is there a Sainsbury's nearby? How quickly can we get there? Will I have enough shopping bags? We don't do plastic bags anymore. All of it. He's going through all of these questions, probably also then realizing that it's the end of the day. And you know how it is when you go into a supermarket at the end of the day and the bakery's done, isn't it? You know, they've baked all the stuff in the morning, so they're not going to be enough. So probably a supermarket isn't the right answer. Have we got a Macro or a Costco nearby? No. Even if we did, we're not going to have enough money to buy everything. And he comes to this conclusion, and his response to Jesus is this: it would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have just a bite. Philip is an analyst. He analyzes the problems. He looks at the scale of the challenge, and he gives a calculated answer. And he wasn't wrong. It would have taken more than half a year's wages to buy enough food for everyone just to have a bite. His problem was that his focus was on the scale of the need and the lack of available provision. There wasn't enough food, and even if there was enough, there wouldn't be enough money. His instinct was to analyze, to calculate, and to conclude that this situation was impossible to resolve. I think many of us are instinctively analysts. I am. Others may put their hands up as well. That when presented with a problem, we analyze. We look at the scale of it, we look at what we have, and we do calculations. Have I got enough of this? Have I got enough of that? Will I have enough people? How will this work out? And we analyze the problems. Practical people often spend time looking at a situation, calculating, and coming to conclusions. Actually, it's a skill. And in one sense, it's a gift from the Lord to be able to bring this kind of analysis to a situation. The trouble is that Philip is so focused on the problem that he fails to consider whether it's actually a problem for Jesus. The issue is not whether or not he was good at the analysis, it's the conclusion that he reached. I've done the sums, it's not possible. But he's talking to Jesus. And Jesus had asked him the question, he already knew the answer, but he just wanted to see where Philip's faith was. So today, Philip, are you going to calculate? Are you going to analyze? Are you going to get stuck in this impossibility? Or are you going to put your faith in me? Philip shows us how easy it is to become experts in what we don't have. To analyze a problem and come to the conclusion that our situation is possible. We don't have enough, whatever it is. It's possible that we can be so focused on a problem and an apparent lack of a solution that we miss the reality of the presence of Jesus in our lives. And Philip should challenge us to look beyond our problems, look beyond our situations, and see the presence of Jesus. The second perspective that we're going to look at this morning is that of Andrew, another of Jesus' disciples, and I've called him the bringer. In response to Jesus asking where they could get the food from, he responds, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish." He's maybe not as keen as Philip to admit that this problem is impossible. Maybe he's trying to please Jesus by at least presenting something to him. So he brings a boy who has just 5 little barley loaves, 2 tiny fish. In reality, that is probably just enough to see that boy get through the day. And nothing more. He didn't bring that food to share. He brought that for his own lunch. And having said, well, here's the boy with 5 small loaves and 2 fish, even Andrew's forced to ask, but how far will this go? He brings what's available, but he's still seeing the problem. But Andrew at least does present some glimmer of faith. He really can't see what's going to be done with such a ridiculously small amount. I mean, in one sense, it's a bit embarrassing. Jesus is there with thousands and thousands of people and saying, how are we going to feed them? And here walks Andrew going, well, I've got 5 small loaves and 2 fish. No one's really thinking that's going to make any difference. But Andrew demonstrates something very powerful to us. Miracles begin when we place what we have into the hands of Jesus. It doesn't matter how small the amount is. It didn't faze Jesus. But Andrew says, this might be ridiculous, but it's worth bringing. It's what I have. And we can so often look at ourselves and our gifts and our skills, the possessions we have, the finances we do or we don't have, and think, well, I just don't have anything worth bringing. And Andrew demonstrates that, well, whenever we bring even the littlest that we have and we give it to Jesus, that's when we see miracles start to happen. And we should never write off what we think we don't have, but bring what we have and give it to Jesus. The third perspective we're going to look at is that of the crowd. Imagine being part of that crowd on that day. They'd followed Jesus. They'd gathered to hear him teach. They were hoping that today's miracle or healing might be for them, it might be for their family, it might be for their friend. And then they were present and a participant in one of the most extraordinary multiplication miracles ever seen. What an incredible day to remember. What a story to tell your children. I was there when Jesus fed the thousands. Verses 14 and 15 tell us a little bit of their response to this miracle. It says, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they intended to come and make him king by force. And so I've called the crowd the consumers. When they'd been witness to such an incredible miracle, their attention turns from their hunger to what else they could get from Jesus. They become hungry for more. Well, if he could feed us like that, well, what else could he do for us? They start to wonder, maybe he's sent from God. They've got maybe an inkling of who he might be. And if he was sent from God, and if he could feed 5,000 people, maybe he could help us out and get rid of those Romans. The Romans who were occupying this land that they lived in. The land that had been promised to them by God. They were looking for the restoration of a nation. And here might be the person who could help them out. But they became so consumed with what Jesus could do for them, that they missed seeing who Jesus really was. Yes, he was really a king, but he wasn't going to be a king on their terms, how they saw it. And the crowds remind, and I think definitely challenge us, that it is possible for us to pursue provision, but miss the provider. It is possible that we treat Jesus like a vending machine, or a service provider, or maybe like some kind of cosmic butler who is there just to meet every need that we have whenever we have a need or a want. And we get so focused on the provision that we miss out who's providing. And it's interesting that Jesus' response to them at that point was to step away from them. He hadn't come to serve their agenda. He'd come very much to serve his Father's agenda. And he was there, and his mission on earth was to bring people into relationship with himself. It's a challenge for us this morning. How do we relate to Jesus? Do we love the provision, but somehow miss out on the relationship with the provider? And the last perspective that we're going to look at this morning and spend a bit more time on is that of John. I've portrayed John as a photographer, a witness, actually like a wedding photographer is what I was thinking. You know, occasionally we get our wedding album out and we look at our wedding photos, and they provide a great memory of a special day. One of the skills, I think, of a good wedding photographer is to capture the whole day in photographs. And in doing so, those photos will often show us things that we didn't know at the time, we weren't aware of, we didn't see. And that's exactly the same for our wedding album. It's probably the same for some of yours as well. You flick through and you think, I didn't know that happened. That's an interesting photo. I actually don't remember them being there sometimes. But you get a bigger picture, and the album reveals things that happened that maybe you'd missed at the time. And John, in this gospel, he's taken many years to reflect on the life of Jesus. And in writing his gospel, it's like he's putting together that wedding album. He's very, very deliberately and carefully choosing the words that he uses, not just to convey the stories so that we have an account of the feeding of the 5,000, but to reveal something to us of what was going on at a bigger scale. He wants us to understand and see just who Jesus is. And so later in this chapter, John returns to this miraculous story of the feeding, and he quotes Jesus explaining what's going on. And so I've joined together verses 14 and 35, which come later in the chapter here, and it says, "After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, Jesus declared, 'I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry.'" John sees what other people had missed, and he calls it a sign. Now, if you've been here over the last few weeks and you've been listening to these sermons on the Gospel of John, you will have heard us talking about signs in John's Gospel. John's Gospel contains 7 events that he calls signs, and these events are to point us to look towards Jesus and see who he really is. And this is the 4th of those 7 signs. But for the very first time in his gospel, John joins a sign with a saying. And so we have the sign of the feeding of the 5,000, and then this saying, "I am the bread of life." It's the first of guess how many? 7. 7 I am sayings that Jesus says about himself, which he's trying to help us see who he really is. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to start seeing the last 3 signs, but also 6 more I am sayings of Jesus, in which he increasingly reveals who he is. And John shows us through the sign and the saying that the real provision here in this story isn't the bread, it's Jesus himself. Yeah. And he does that very carefully through some of the details of the story. So let's look at the details and how John uses them to build up this picture that's bigger than just the miracle. Well, first of all, John gives us the detail about the time of year. Verse 4 tells us that the Jewish Passover festival was near. Passover and Exodus are the great stories in Israel's history of God providing. In the Passover, God makes provision of lamb's blood on doorposts in order that the people of Israel have freedom from slavery. It's the beginning of their exodus. As they journey through to the promised land, God provides them in the wilderness with manna, daily food provision from heaven. When they're thirsty in the desert and there's no water from them, God brings water from the rock. John is saying, do you see? Remember your stories of God providing for you in the wilderness. Remember how God provided for you at Passover. Can you see what's happening here? Here is God providing again. Here he is, right in your presence, doing it again. The God who said, "I will be your provider" to Abraham is providing right in your presence. The second thing he wants to do as a sort of moment of detail is to focus on the abundance that Jesus provides. Verse 12 says, they all had enough to eat. And then Jesus said, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." Here is a demonstration of God's provision. When God provides, he provides more than enough. It's a miracle enough that 5,000 people got anything to eat. But they didn't just get enough to make the journey home to have a proper meal later on in the evening. They ate enough that they were all satisfied. God's provision isn't just adequate, it's more than enough. Everyone ate as much as they wanted. And then not just that, but God's provision is abundant. It's more than enough. And so the verses tell us that 12 baskets of leftovers were collected. Matt, when he was preaching last week, had lots of images of baskets. He was talking about basket weaving, wasn't he, it's one of his illustrations last Sunday. The gospel writers are quite specific here about the types of baskets that they're referring to. They were meal baskets. That would be used to collect food and to, transport a meal. And here, 12 meal portions were collected. So the 12 disciples who served Jesus in this miracle, they'd given out to the crowd, they'd given out to the crowd, they'd given out to the crowd. And Jesus went, "You've served me. Here's some for you to eat." The abundance had purpose as well. When Jesus provides, he provides more than enough. He provides abundantly, but everything in its extravagance has purpose. And John is saying, look, do you see? God's provision is generous, more than enough, and nothing is wasted. And the third detail that we can see in this story is in the I am saying. We're going to look at this in more detail in a few weeks' time, so I'm going to refrain from preaching all of that context. But Jesus says in verse 35, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." And this is where John's been pointing to all along. The bread was a temporary filling for their stomachs. They were going to get hungry soon enough, the same as any of us do when we've had a meal. Hunger comes back, doesn't it? But Jesus provides eternal satisfaction for our souls. Not a temporary filling on a Sunday morning that runs out on a Monday, but an eternal satisfaction to our souls. And Jesus is not just the provider. He's not just the one who takes the bread and gives it. Here, Jesus says, "I'm the provision. I am the bread of life," he says. And at this Passover, John records Jesus breaking bread and satisfying people's hunger. There's one more Passover left in John's gospel that we're going to look at. And it's the Passover where Jesus goes to the cross, where Jesus breaks his body, where his body becomes the provision for our eternal life. And John is pointing from this story to the next, from one Passover to another. It says, look at Jesus providing. Look at the end of the story. Jesus is the bread of life. John is saying, look, do you see that God's provision is personal? Jesus himself is the answer to our deepest hunger. And so I want to ask you this morning, where are you in this story? Because I think in different ways we can place ourselves in different points in this story. I think at different times we can relate to Philip. We can relate to Andrew. We can relate to the crowd. Today, is there a situation where you found yourself stuck, analysing? You're looking at a problem or seeing what's lacking. And Jesus wants to invite you today to say, okay, you've done your analysis, you've done your calculation. Would you bring that problem to me? Let's see what I can do with that. Perhaps you're feeling that in a circumstance, what you have just seems too little. There's no point me doing anything with this. I haven't got anything. Well, the encouragement this morning is to at least be like Andrew and say, well, Lord, this is all I have. I'll give it to you, and let's see what you can do with it. Perhaps this morning you're challenged that perhaps in some areas of your life you might be treating Jesus like a service provider rather than a saviour. We can all do that at different times. We get used to the generosity and the abundance of Jesus that we start to take it for granted, and our relationship with him is characterized in that way. And Jesus says, well, I'd love to bless you. I'm going to keep providing for you, but I really want to just relate to you and love you. Would you come to me this morning? Maybe this morning you're wanting to see what John saw. Perhaps you're here for the first time, you're exploring who Jesus is and what he's like. Well, Jesus says, I want this morning to introduce myself to you as the bread of life. If you're walking through life and you found that nothing else satisfies, well, then Jesus gives a promise. He says, I'm the bread of life. And if you come to him, you never, ever go hungry. And so we're going to sing as a first response this morning. But then there's going to be an opportunity for us to pray. And if you want for someone to come and pray with you. And I want to encourage you at two levels this morning. First of all, if there is a situation of need that you have today, I want to encourage you to bring it afresh to Jesus. Maybe you have done many, many times. Maybe you're in the middle of something, but I've felt the Lord say, would you just bring those things to me today because I'm here to release provision. And that might be material. You might be looking for particular practical need, financial provision. It might be physical. It might be a particular healing that you're looking for. And Jesus is here this morning and he wants to release provision amongst us. But perhaps this morning there's also an invitation to meet the provider himself, the bread of life. Jesus is here this morning to release life to us. And if that's you this morning, as Ray and Sylvia pick up a response after we've sung, I just want to encourage you, come and meet the provider this morning. He wants to release life. He wants to release more than enough, and he wants to release abundance into your life. And he promises, whoever comes to me will never go hungry. So should we stand? Let's sing and worship together.